In this video, I wanted to consider the co-evolution of the Mario, Zelda, and Metroid franchises, and what this signifies for how Nintendo might look at carrying Metroid on going forward. Now, this isn't my prescription for what I think Metroid Prime should do, or even specifically what it could do, but I want to consider the evolution of Nintendo's thinking about game design, about their interests and approaches, and show how, although there are clear aspects of difference between these three series that will obviously remain, there are also symmetries in the paths they've taken over the years, which I think go beyond simple coincidence and speak to the philosophies and, of course, are influenced by the technological considerations at the heart of Nintendo EPD at different times. So let's go all the way back to the Famicom years and talk about the original Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, and Metroid. Mario and Zelda released half a year apart, and Metroid dropped later, starting a trend that would only widen of Metroid being somewhat behind the other two. These three had strong commonalities at this point in that they were the first character-driven franchises to be really focused on the home console market, and therefore on providing a longer experience. Because of technical limitations, some of the same solutions were used. Mario's secret passages on the roof give rise to Zelda's secret bombable walls, and there are basically a core gameplay mechanic by Metroid. Of course, Mario is course-based, Zelda is top-down, and Metroid is open yet side-scrolling, but they're fundamentally different responses to the question of how can you create a more open-ended home console experience using the technology of the Famicom with strong characters at their heart. Skip a generation forward, and we see the Super NES era. This was a period where these core franchises released what, to many, are the apex forms of at least the franchises as they were in their 2D embodiments: Super Mario World, Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Super Metroid. The characters, heroes, and villains are now embedded for the most part, with many iconic characters and elements added or made even more central, from Yoshi to the Lost Woods to the narrative elements around Super Metroid. The technology of the 16-bit era allowed them to essentially remake the original titles with a far more refined sensibility, and while some of the edges that were later knocked off, such as the openness of Zelda 1, included elements that would later be reinstated, these were clearly hugely polished versions of what these series were to become. Already it should be noted that the gap between the series was growing. While Mario and Zelda were released in Japan at least in 1990 and 1991 respectively, it was early 1994 before Metroid finally returned. The reason seems fairly clear. Mario and Zelda were both driven by Shigeru Miyamoto himself, while Metroid was always a slightly distant relation. This gap would only grow, but so would the symmetry between them. The leap to 3D was clearly the most radical change in the history of these franchises, and in all cases led to a branching franchise where we get a 2D Mario, 2D Metroid, and top-down Zelda, as well as the fresh 3D iterations they now existed in. Mario 64 was a blueprint game essentially, not just for Mario, but for 3D platforming itself. It wasn't quite the first out of the gate, but it was the first to thoroughly and comprehensively make a full-scale 3D game work with thought about controls and all the different features they would need to work out. Zelda Ocarina of Time also rethought the gameplay conventions for 3D, with elements like Z-targeting and companion guide characters introduced. For Metroid, released a full 4 years after Ocarina and on new hardware, the transition also required rethinking, but in ways unique to Metroid, and so the first-person perspective gameplay using Samus's visor was born. The thing about this era is that the aesthetics and gameplay beats were kept very steady. You could argue that all three were to a large degree spiritual reincarnations of their Super NES versions, just in a new form. I won't labour the point by comparing the sequel titles to each too long, but it's interesting to me that Sunshine, Majora, and Echoes are all more niche and often more difficult than their illustrious predecessors, as they tried to take their series into new areas within the 3D space. The next big leap I'm going to consider, though, is the Wii generation. By now, Mario, Zelda, and Metroid were well established in their 3D forms, and each had rather separate concerns, meaning that you could argue that there was the least connective tissue between the three philosophically during this era. The Mario team was trying to make Miyamoto's oddball vision of a spherical platformer come to life, but in form it was a sequel to Super Mario World, with the world exploded to a course-based galaxy. Meanwhile, the Zelda team was trying to fix what at the time was the controversial aesthetic choice to make Zelda Wind Waker so cartoonish by leaning into a moodier title that tacked closer to the spirit of Ocarina. Metroid Prime 3 also had things to prove after the low sales of Echoes, and in some respects was touted as a return to the original despite the larger scope. Commonalities in this era included the attempt to broaden the scope of the games using the new hardware and, of course, the incorporation of motion controls with varying degrees of effectiveness. Now, the next leap for Mario and Zelda was towards a far more tight toy box experience. Super Mario 3D World is the pinnacle of a course-based game, but the emphasis was clearly fun over flash. Skyward Sword has the open skies, of course, but this was really a sideline. The bulk of the game was about as linear a Zelda as you could imagine, and sometimes I think of this as a prototype for a course-paced Zelda title, where you're essentially taken from puzzle-solving area to puzzle-solving area. But what of Metroid? Well, Metroid also stepped into being a far more controlled franchise, with Other M making the story an explicit part of the action, and like Mario, the gameplay tried to tilt back a little in the direction of the 2D games by removing the first-person perspective. It's fairly clear that, to a large degree, this era of Nintendo is, if not a failure, then something they want to move beyond. The closed philosophy of Skyward Sword has been thoroughly rejected by Eiji Aonuma in recent years, to the point where he said in interviews for Echoes of Wisdom that open choices of how to solve puzzles is at the core of what Zelda is. The strong story-led approach of Metroid was heavily criticized in Other M as well. As for 3D World, while it was critically acclaimed, it didn't generate the kind of excitement and imagination that would drive the Wii U out of the rut that it was in. All three franchises needed to find a way to break out. At the dawn of the Switch era, we had Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey. The key thing here is that both had a desire for openness. Breath of the Wild was an aggressive experimentation with being as open as possible, but even Super Mario Odyssey explicitly returned to the 3D game's sandbox roots. In the case of Zelda, the whiplash was so severe that they called this process rethinking the conventions of Zelda. And while for many it was a huge success, for lovers of the old style of games primarily, the new games don't really hit the mark in the same way. Now, the difficulty is where to put Metroid Prime 4 into this equation, because in certain respects, it is clearly the most open-ended out of the Prime games, due to the massive Great Desert in the middle and the various open-ended quests that you do in that. But fundamentally, this is a massive clash with the far more traditional philosophy that drives the rest of the game. The Metroidvania genre requires precision planning for the paths that people can take, and making it loosey-goosey and open works against the core principles of the way those titles are constructed. I rather wonder whether the abandoned 2017 version of the game would have experimented in other ways, with opening the game out, but for whatever reason it failed, and the 2025 game feels to me in many ways incredibly Skyward Swordy, and not just because of the mind beetle and the way the desert feels like the sky, dusty and barren. It feels like a game series that is brilliant at doing what it's doing, but equally hasn't really figured out how the series can take a step forward, or if that's even possible. In many respects, the types of levels that we see in Metroid Prime 4 are very clear echoes of Metroid Prime, just as Skyward Sword in many ways echoed Ocarina of Time. For Zelda, that process of change was painful and involved essentially reinventing what the series was, even if it did ultimately lead to tremendous success. For Mario, which was always more structurally fluid, it was a less shocking transition, but I find it interesting that they released Bowser's Fury as a kind of experimentation, suggesting that they were not completely sure about where to take Mario next and wanted to try something out first. For Metroid, I think it remains a puzzle that they will want to try to solve, but it's also challenging because of the small number of people who are generally interested in Metroid games, and the fact that the existing audience is passionately keen on the very specific type of gameplay that we've seen so far. I think we could argue, though, that the current era we are in is now a new era as well, and one about the exploitation of open mechanics as a core principle to allow control of the environment and more of a sandbox approach to gaming. We don't have a new Mario, but we do have Donkey Kong Bonanza, and that's by the same group, as well, of course, as Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. With Donkey Kong's destructible terrain and Zelda's Ultra Hand, these games are about giving the environment far more interactability than ever before, essentially turning these huge open worlds into toy boxes. What does this mean for Metroid then? Well, there's nothing to say that Nintendo need to evolve Metroid Prime, and the risk is that anything they do will be hated by a large number of the core audience. But equally, that core audience is tiny, and yet the potential of Metroid remains quite large. The core difficulty is that the move to openness is a route that Metroid just can't really follow, and so that particular transition that Zelda and Mario took in 2017 was always going to be a very tough one for Metroid to find a way to match. However, Nintendo is nothing if not creatively courageous, and I do think they will ultimately want to find a next step forward, one that respects the conventions of what made Metroid successful, but perhaps also one which empowers the player with a more interactive world and with more openness for players to experiment. I'll cycle back to what this could look like in a separate video, as that will become highly speculative, but I think that is probably where Nintendo's thinking is right now. In the meantime, thanks for watching, thanks to the channel's Patreon supporters, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.